Right, with Hashem's help, we will learn today Yevamos Daf Chav Zayin. We left off yesterday Chav Vav Amid Beis. Three lines from the bottom, V'Shmuel Amar. The case here is a case of 5 brothers, 3 of which married 3 sisters. So the names we are using is that you have your Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, 5 brothers that are living at the same time. And Reuven and Shimon and Levi marry Rachel, Leah, and Bilhah. All 3 of these brothers died childless. What we learned in the previous year was the following Chiddush of Rav. That after one surviving brother, Yehuda, let's say, does chalitza with Rachel, after the other surviving brother, Yisachar, let's say, does chalitza with Bilhah, now you have Leah, which is the 3rd sister that needs to receive chalitza. Says Rav the Chiddush that Leah needs to receive chalitza both from Yehuda and from Yisachar. Why? Because he introduced a concept called a chalitza psula. The concept is, chalitza is in the place of yibum. Yibum is done by one brother for all of the brothers. Only one brother has to do yibum. Which is why, when a person chooses, instead of doing yibum, to do chalitza, that one brother's chalitza is effective for all of the brothers, and the woman now becomes free to marry whoever she wants. But whenever there is a scenario where yibum is not an option, like in the case that we just mentioned, sai, because of the reason the Mishnah spoke about, which is called achoy zikukasei, as well as in this additional case, in the names that we're using, that Leah cannot go into yibum, cannot have yibum, not with Yehuda, nor with Yisachar, because she is called achoyz chalutzasei, because there is a rabbinic prohibition for Yehuda to marry Leah, aside of the fact that she was also achoyz zikukasei, she is also the sister of Rachel, with whom Yehuda did chalitza. So since he cannot take her into yibum, so the bond between them is weaker than the normal bond. So therefore the effect of the chalitza is weaker than the normal effect of chalitza. True, the chalitza is effective to sever the zika between Leah and Yehuda himself. But Yehuda's chalitza does not resolve the zika between Leah and Yisachar. So she needs to get chalitza from both, and then the Gemara clarified a bigger chiddush, that if that were to be the case, according to Rav, then whenever yibum cannot be effective, the chalitza should not resolve the zika with all of the brothers, and ein hachanami. And the reason why Rav only spoke about the 3rd sister, the emtsois, needing chalitza from both, was because each one died separately. First only one died, and then only chalitza was done with her. That was a perfectly good chalitza. Then the other sister died, and true that one brother couldn't do chalitza with her, couldn't do yibum, but the other brother that yet didn't do anything could do yibum with her. So then the 2nd chalitza was a real chalitza, and that's why he only spoke about the 3rd one. All that is Rav, and now continuing with Shmuel. So Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, Echad chaylutz lekulam. Shmuel disagrees with Rav. And he says that in the case that we mentioned, 5 brothers and 3 sisters, one brother, right, let's say the brother is Yehuda, the eldest surviving brother, he can do chalitza with Rachel, and with Leah, and with Bilhah. Which means, the way it's going to come out in the beginning, and indeed the way we're going to learn in the Maskana Rav Ashi, that Shmuel disagrees with the concept of a chalitza psula. He holds that even where there is, so to say, a chalitza psula, one brother's chalitza would work for all the brothers. However, challenges the Gemara. Michti, behold, Shma'in and Leil Shmuel. We know that Shmuel holds, as we will see in Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, that Shmuel does accept a concept called chalitza ma'aliyah, which means there's something called a superior chalitza, and there's something called a inferior chalitza. And Shmuel holds that whenever there's a choice between the superior and the inferior, you have to pick the superior. You're not allowed to pick the inferior. That Shmuel holds chalitza ma'alya be'inon. What does that mean? Where do we have superior or inferior chalitza? The Amar Shmuel daf chav zayin amud aleph that chalatz la'achoyos loy nifteru tzarois. The case that Shmuel is speaking about is, speak about a simple case. There are only 3 brothers. You don't even need 4 brothers for this case, right? Let's halt kop chavri. You have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Here, not only did Reuven and Shimon marry co-sisters, which is the case we had until now, not co-sisters, sisters, that Reuven married Rachel and Shimon married Leah. On top of that, each one of these brothers had an additional co-wife. Now, what did we learn in our Mishnah? We learned in our Mishnah the concept of achois zikukase, which means that if both brothers die, the remaining brother Levi is not allowed to do yibum with neither of the sisters because each one is achois zikukase. Now, the rule is that one needs to do either yibum or chalitza from every bias's wife, but when there's a wife and a co-wife, you don't need to do it to both. You can do it either to the wife or to the co-wife, either yibum or chalitza, and it's effective for both. Shmuel says that in such a case, you need to do the chalitza to the co-wives and the tzara. Why? Because being that yibum cannot be done to the wives, so such a chalitza, which is in the place of the yibum, Shmuel calls that a inferior chalitza. Because the same logic, the bond is not that strong. V'haraya yibum cannot be done. And here you have a co-wife, and as the Gemara accepts in the Havamina, and as Rav Ashi will again confirm in the Maskana, you should know that there is an additional isur to do yibum with your Zukuka's co-wife. So just like the remaining brother Levi cannot do yibum neither with Rachel nor with Leah, each one is a chayziku kasai, that prohibition also goes on to the tzara, which is what we're learning in this whole Masechta. That when you have, let's speak about a deoraisa, if there's an isur erva, so then tzara's erva also becomes asur. Right. If the erva is asur even in chalitza, no yibum nor chalitza, so then that exemption goes also for the tzara. Here, there's taka no isur chalitza. There's a chiyuv chalitza on a chayziku kasei, but you can't do yibum. That prohibition also goes on the tzara. However, the way we understand in the Havamina and the way we're going to accept in the Maskana, that isur of marrying tzaras ziku kasei, tzaras chayziku kasei, is a lesser isur somehow. It's a lesser problem. And therefore, Shmuel holds, whenever you have an inferior or a superior, do the superior chalitza. Which is why Shmuel says that if you taka did chalitza on both sisters, it's not enough. It only worked for them, but nifteru tzarais, seemingly Shmuel is saying you have to do chalitza on each tzara. So let's come back over here. Even if Shmuel doesn't agree with Rav's idea of a chalitza psula, let's think about our case. There were 3 brothers, there were 5 brothers, but we're speaking about 3 of them died. Well, the moment 3 of them died, here taka there's no co-wives, but the logic should be the same. Once one living brother, we're using the word Yehuda, did chalitza with the first wife, what are the other 2 wives to him? Achois chalutzasei. Achois chalutzasei are women with whom you're not allowed to do yibum. There is still a living brother. The living brother did not yet do, not yibum, which he can do, nor chalitza, which he could do and has to do with either of the other 2. So even if Shmuel disagrees with Rav's idea of chalitza psula, we know that Shmuel holds of the idea of a chalitza ma'alya. So let's read it inside, that heicha the kaim chalitza de Shimon. Right? The cases, the names the Gemara is using the whole time is that the 2 living brothers is Reuven and Shimon. The 2 living brothers. The other 3 died. That whenever Shimon can do a proper chalitza ksheira, is chalitz lal Reuven chalitza pasula? Will Shmuel allow Reuven, who already did chalitza with 1 sister, which rendered the other 2 sisters into achois chalutzasoi? Such a chalitza is such a connection. A yibum is aser, which would make the chalitza inferior. So why would Shmuel say that one can do chalitza with all 3? Answers the Gemara that my echad choylitz lekulam nami de ka'amar a'im tzois. You're right. Shmuel didn't mean what you thought he meant. All right, let's go to our names. There are 3 sisters over here. Yadari halskop, Reuven, one should do chalitza with one. now the other two for him become prohibited in Yibum because of, first of all, they were chayzer kokasai, and now they're not on top of that, they're chayz chalitzasai. So the other living brother, who did not yet do chalitza with any of them, he's the better brother now. His chalitza will be a chalitza ma'aliyah, because he doesn't have the isur of Yibum also of a chayz chalutzasai. He should take a do to the other. But now this third one is equally prohibited on both brothers. The third one is both asur and Yibum because she is a chayz kokasai. On top of that, this third one is also a chayz chalutzasai from both brothers, so she's equally bad. Rav holds, since it's a chalitza psula, she needs to get chalitza from each brother. Shmuel holds no, she can get chalitza from one of the brothers. She can't marry either of them. Shmuel doesn't hold, according to this opinion, of the idea of a chalitza psula, that you need chalitza from everyone. Shmuel does hold that when you have two women, two options, one chalitza is better than the other, because Yibum with one would have been at least less problematic or not problematic. You should do the better. But when and if you don't do the better, if it's all equal, and if you don't do the better, you have to do it with the other one. Do it again. Correct. However, here, everyone, as far as the third surviving sister is concerned, both brothers are the same.
In our case, right, if the second wife went and got chalitza from the first brother,
then she has to get it again. Then she has to get it again from the second brother. And when now, what does the word kulam mean? Kulam also makes sense, because according to Shmuel, it's going to chap that from the two remaining brothers, one brother will only do chalitza with one, but the other brother will do chalitza with two. And that's what he meant with kulam. There's a concept called ruban kekulam. Now they say by davening on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we just came off the high holidays, we say Meloich al kol haaretz kuloi. Isn't that repetitive? Think about it. Meloich al kol haaretz kuloi. Because we want Hashem to be a king, not on rubai kekuloi. We want Hashem to be a king on takakuloi. And we have a concept that sometimes when they say the word kol, which means all doesn't always halachically mean all can sometimes mean the majority. Let's read it inside. I think the Gemara of a kulam ka'amar. So the Gemara says no. Kivin the ruba gabei, since relative to the two brothers, one of them did it on two from the three. That's roiv, that's majority. Is kololei kulei. So that's the first answer. Clear. So no, Shmuel disagrees with Rav in the idea of chalitza psula. However, Shmuel does.
What word kulam used?
Shmuel said the words in Daf Chav Vav Amid Beis. Shmuel says echad chayletz lekulan. And this first explanation is saying that he didn't mean that one brother should do chalitza with all three. He meant only with two. Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to say Gavaldik. The Gemara is now going to say that Shmuel is going to agree with Rav. These words are not spoken out in the Gemara, but that's the way we're learning the Gemara. Shmuel is going to hold of the concept of achayitz chalutzasei. However, if you remember yesterday's shir, Rav's din was only based on the fact of the Eish Zika. Shmuel now, we're going to explain Shmuel's words that Echad Chaylitz Lekulan based on Shmuel holding that Ein Zika, there is a concept of Chalitza Psula, and let's read it inside. Iba Yisema, or I'll tell you that Ki Ka'amar Shmuel Chalitza Ma'alya Be'inan. When did Shmuel say, in the case that we gave of three brothers, two of which married two sisters, and each one had a co-wife, comes along Shmuel and he says that a person has to do chalitza with the co-wives and not with the sisters themselves. That's Hana Mina Lemiftar Tzarasam. That's only when it comes to one chalitza being enough for both. Right? Each one comes with a co-wife. Avol mi patra nafsha patron. However, the Gemara is saying, don't compare a case where there is one widow to two brothers, which is the case over here, versus Shmuel's case where there are two widows to one brother. When there are two widows from one bias, all right, each brother married a sister and a co-wife. When two widows fall to one brother, one of the widows is prohibited on the brother because of, let's say, achayzikul kasai, right? Or shaloi tivatal teiras yibum, if Shmuel will hold that ein zika. So therefore, Shmuel holds, why not do the chalitza on the co-wife? Do it on the tzara. But whenever you have one widow that is falling to two brothers, and as we'll explain in a moment, Shmuel will hold ein zika, And a chanami yavi iser of achois chalutzasai, no question about that. So once, let's say, Reuven did chalitza with one of the sisters, so the other sisters are asur also because of, so what? Shmuel doesn't care, Shmuel doesn't hold of the concept of chalitza psula. Very simple. Don't compare a case where two widows fall to one brother versus a case where one widow falls to two brothers. And Shmuel holds.
He doesn't hold of Achos Chalutzasa. He said that that's not an issue.
That's not, no, of course it's an isur, but he doesn't say that since one sister is usher to one brother because of a chayz chalutzasai, and this sister is not usher to the other brother because of a chayz chalutzasai, that makes the other brother's chalitza a better chalitza. No. None of the brothers can marry anyone here. And chalitza is still needed. But it's not a case of an erva. So one brother can do chalitza to all three. That was the premise of Rav, was the idea of a chalitza psula. Whenever you have a chalitza psula, the chalitza of one doesn't work for the other. Shmuel disagrees with that. Shmuel holds there's a concept of whenever there's a chalitza ma'alya, a inferior or a superior, do the superior, that's only when there are two widows from one bais falling to one brother. So one brother has to disconnect from that house. Which one should he use? There is where Shmuel says, look, which one is inferior, which one is a superior. In the case that we're learning over here, there are 5 brothers married to 3 sisters. Each sister is falling from a different bias. Each sister, with none of the sisters, you can do a yibum. So the fact that the yibum with one might be more prohibited than the other doesn't bother Shmuel. Shmuel doesn't buy into the idea of chalitza, of a chalitza psul. Okay, let's go weiter. Gufa, where did Shmuel say his din about a superior or a inferior chalitza? That choletz la'achayos, that was the case that we mentioned, right? There were 3 brothers only. 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon, each one married 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. On top of that, Reuven married a co-wife to Rachel, and Shimon married another wife to Leah. And now they both died. Says Shmuel, choletz la'achayos, if the living brother Levi will only do chalitza with their sisters, he has to do it with both. But if he'll do it to Rachel and to Leah, loy nifteru tzaras. The tzaras won't be off the hook. They also will need an additional chalitza. But if he did it with tzaras, then nifteru achayos, and we're going to have to work this out in a moment. That was din number 1. Din number 2. Look at this case. Cholatz lebalas haget. Here we're speaking about a case, right? The second case of Shmuel are the only 2 brothers. One brother dies and he leaves a wife. What do you have to do with the wife? Simple, normal case. Either yibum or chalitza. What will happen if the living brother, instead of asking what to do, didn't want to be with her, decided that he's married to her somehow, understood zika like a marriage, and gave her a get? So we learned this case before. So the din is that since he gave her a get, he's not allowed to marry her. More than that. Not only can he not marry her, but if the brother who died had 2 wives, if he gave a get only to one, he can no longer do yibum with either of them, or with neither of them. By chalitza, we learned that together. If the living brother gives chalitza to either of the wives, what's the din? What do we say? Kiven shaloi bana, shuv lo yivna. There's a isur, there's a law to marry them. Here he didn't do chalitza, he only gave a get. But the Chachamim said a get looks like a chalitza. So he's not allowed to marry them. What does he need to do? He has to give chalitza to them. So now, if there were 2 co-wives, says Shmuel, that who should he give chalitza to? Think about it. Shmuel holds of an inferior or a superior chalitza. Shmuel says that if he gave chalitza to the one whom he gave a get, since his connection to her is a lesser connection. Why? Because he already gave her a get. So the zika was weaker, so the chalitza is weaker. So Shmuel holds, again, when there are 2 widows falling to one brother, Shmuel holds, give chalitza to the one that chalitza is called the better chalitza. If you, he didn't know the dinim. So loy niftera tzara. But if he gives chalitza to the tzara, then niftera labalas haget. And the third case of Shmuel, explaining the idea of a superior versus a inferior chalitza, that in such a case you have to do chalitza with the woman with whom it's superior, and if you do it with the woman with whom it's inferior, you have to do it to the other one. The third case will be cholatz lebalas hamaymer. That again, a man, Reuven and Shimon, just 2 brothers. Reuven dies. Reuven had 2 wives. Shimon decided to do Yibum with one of them. Midrabanan, you can't just do Yibum, you have to do Maimer. Oh, now what happens if a person did Maimer and then he decides he doesn't want to be with him? Remember, we learned that together. Most of the Tanoim held that Maimer is only a rabbinic Yibum. Therefore, if you don't want to be with her, what needs to happen? Two things. You have to give Chalitza. Why do you have to give Chalitza? Because Middo Eraisa Maimer meant nothing. But on the other hand, if you're just going to give Chalitza, she won't be free to marry anyone she wants. Since she got a rabbinic marriage, you have to cut off that marriage through a get. So the one to whom you gave a maimer is going to need both. There needs to be a get and a... Now, once you give a get, the question is who should you give chalitza to? So again, Shmuel says that if he gave chalitza to the one who he gave maimer, her tzara is not free. Why is that? Because since the...
Chalitza is inferior.
Why is the chalitza inferior to the one he gave maimer to? Because she is the one that needs two severances, which means that for her chalitza is not enough. If for her chalitza is not enough, chalitza for her is inferior. So he should give, ideally, according to Shmuel.
Same case as the previous one, except in that case he gave a get by mistake. Here he has to give the get.
Correct.
Because there was minor.
No, it's either the marriage is weaker or the ways of severing, there needs to be more steps to sever. More steps to sever means that chalitza in itself is not strong enough. You need chalitza and a get. Let's just fit it inside. And we're saying, and therefore, the same logic, if he gives chalitza to the tzara, then niftara balas maimer, obviously after giving her a get.
You still have to give her a get.
Absolutely.
What's the order? Get first?
Doesn't make a difference. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to challenge the first case of Shmuel. Okay, the first case of Shmuel was that there were three sisters, right? There were three brothers. Two brothers married two sisters, and each one married a co-wife. Both brothers died. It can even be with one living brother. So Shmuel taught you the din that the living brother, first of all, we know from our Mishnah, cannot do Yibum, but when he does Chalitza, Shmuel says if he does Chalitza with the sisters, for them it worked, but it doesn't work for the co-wives. If he does chalitza for the co-wives, it works for the sisters as well. Let's analyze that. It says, why is Shmuel saying that if he does chalitza to the sisters, even though it worked for them, but it doesn't work for the co-wives, because the Haviyem, the Bach says the words la, achois isha bezikam, because why is the chalitza inferior? Because Yibum was prohibited. Why is Yibum prohibited? Because of the rabbinic problem. You can't marry Achai Zuku Kasai. So the Gemara says, 1 second, Chalatz Litzoreis Nami Leniftaru Achayes. Just like the rabbis did not allow you to marry Achai Zuku Kasai, you're not allowed to marry Tzoras Achai Zuku Kasai. The Havilu Tzoreis Achais Isha Bezika. So they're both equally rabbinically prohibited. And if they're both equally prohibited, and as we said, Shmuel does not accept the idea of chalitza ptsula, means if they're both equally bad, even though Yibum is not permitted, doesn't matter, chalitza should work for both. Answers the Gemara that it must be that this din of Shmuel is based on Shmuel's holding Ein Zika. And let's make it very clear, the Ein Zika only explains why they're not considered a tsaras rabbinic erva. Because Ein Zika to begin with, it doesn't explain why you can't do chalitza on the sisters. Because if Ein Zika, do it on the sisters. We'll get to that in a moment. By the way, the Gemara says, like we said yesterday, we know that Shmuel holds Yesh Zika, which is why Shmuel holds that a man cannot marry his Shemeres, his Yevamos, who passed away, the mother. So the Gemara says that these dinim of Shmuel was based l'divrei ha'emer Ein Zika ka'amar. End of parentheses. So this din is based on Ein Zika. And if Ein Zika, then there is no problem in Tzaras, right? Achois, Isha, Bezika. There's no Zika. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Iyachi, if that's the case, if Shmuel holds that Ein Zika, then Cholatz la'achois, Amai l'nitru l'tzaros, then why wouldn't you be allowed to do Chalitza with the sisters themselves? In other words, they're both equal. Even though, as we said yesterday and a few days ago, we learned that even if you hold Ein Zika, the din of our Mishnah stands, which is that, forget about co-wives. There are 3 brothers, 2 brothers married, 2 sisters, and they both died. Everyone holds that the living brother, choltzois v'lo Yevamos, he cannot do yibum. And how did we explain it if you learn Ein Zika? Not because of Zika, because there's a prohibition of you being mevatel, the whole mitzvah of yibum, which means that if you'll do yibum with one sister, then automatically the other sister, you cannot do yibum with because she'll become your wife's sister. Or even in the case of 4 brothers, the way we explained in the Mishnah, if one brother will do yibum with one, the other one might die. However, explained to the Shainim that if you hold Ein Zika, the isur of not being allowed to marry in the case of 2 sisters and 4 brothers, or 2 sisters and 3 brothers, is not an essential or an intrinsic isur. It's not that she is prohibited. She's really mutar. She's mutar to go into yibum. But the Chachamim were afraid of something that might happen. Someone might die, or doing this will cause something else to happen. That's not a real isur in herself. So therefore, going back, if Shmuel doesn't accept the concept of chalitza psula, the way we're learning now, and Shmuel holds Ein Zika, which is why Shmuel holds that you can do chalitza with one co-wife, and that chalitza with the co-wife will free her and free one of the sisters, right? The co-wife who is the sister. So why can't you do chalitza with the wives themselves? The way it seems in the Mishnah. Choltzos, who choltzos? Anyone you want. Explains the Gemara, and the Gemara goes,
if he did yibum with one of the sisters, right?
If he did chalitza with one of the sisters.
No, if he did yibum theoretically, wouldn't that automatically invalidate the other sister because achais?
Which is why now that I do yibum. No one is denying the fact that you can't do yibum, right. But we're not the Rav who holds that whenever yibum cannot be done, then chalitza doesn't work for everyone. Shmuel doesn't hold of that. Shmuel just holds whenever there is a superior or an inferior, you got to do the superior. But now, if we're saying that Shmuel holds Ein Zika, the Gemara is arguing. First of all, by the co-wives, they're both equally good. They're both equal, and even in the sisters, let's walk it through. And let's work out the cases. Bishlei mitzara derachel, loiti pater dekiven dechalas leleya. Let's speak about a case where first he did chalitza with one of the sisters. He did chalitza with Leah. Levi did chalitza with Leah. Now, again, we're saying that the Ein Zika means that achos zikul kasa is not an essential isur. So let's take that off the table. But achos chalutzasai is a essential isur, which means that once a person did chalitza with Leah, this living brother Levi, he's not allowed to marry Rachel, aside of the fact that she's achos zikul kasai, by tivatel toiras yibum. He can't do yibum with her because she is achos chalutzasai. He didn't marry, he did chalitza to Leah. He can't marry Rachel because she is achayitz chalutzasai. So if he did chalitza with one sister, he can't do chalitza he can't marry the other sister because she's called achayitz chalutzasai. And if he has to choose between doing chalitza with Rachel or doing chalitza with Rachel's co-wife, who is the better one to do it with? Here it makes sense to do it with the co-wife. Because the co-wife's chalitza is superior, because the connection he has with Rachel is inferior because she is achayitz chalutzasai. However, asked the Gemara, elotzara delei antipater. But when he went ahead and he did chalitza to the first sister, why did Shmuel say that if you did chalitza with the sisters, you have to do chalitza with the co-wife? So why not? At least the chalitza with the first sister should be just as good as doing chalitza with that sister's co-wife. You can't do yibum to anyone. You can't do yibum to anyone. We're saying that Shmuel holds Ein Zika. There's no essential isur here. Chachamim said, don't do yibum. I won't do yibum.
When he did Rachel,
The first one here was the Leah. When he did
the first sister that he did
chalitza with,
her co-wife
should be exempt also. Answers the Gemara, that's taka what Shmuel meant. My loy nifturu tzaris nami dikahamar. What did Shmuel mean when he said do chalitza on the co-wives? Plural, he didn't mean co-wives. He was only speaking about the second sister. The first sister, you can do it either on her or on the co-wife. But only when it comes to the second sister, now that you did chalitza on Leah. So now Rachel became achayis chalutzasai. So now says Shmuel, do chalitza on the tzara. Atzara de Rachel. I frag the Gemara that Shmuel used the words in the plural sense. V'hatzarois ka'amar. So the Gemara says, yeah, he didn't speak about this case. When there's two sisters, there's a Rachel and a Leah. He was speaking about the tzara of Rachel only, not about the tzara of Leah. But tzara is the alma. He was speaking about in general situations. Whenever you have a situation where there were two brothers married to two sisters and each one had a co-wife, in such a case, says Shmuel, that the second house, the second bias, in this case Rachel and the co-wife, there you have to do chalitza only on the co-wife. And if you did chalitza on the sister, you have to do another chalitza with the co-wife. Frek the Gemara, if that's the case, cholatz l'tzarois nifteru achayos. But you are claiming that if he taka did it on the tzaros, then the sisters will be exempt. Frek the Gemara, that's not true. Va'atzaras Rachel mi miftera. How can the living brothers chalitza with the co-wife of Rachel exempt Rachel? V'hatanan, we learned asur adam bitzaras kiroivas chalutzasoi. She's equally prohibited, just like a man is not allowed to marry his chalitza's sister, achois chalitzasoi. Equally, you're not allowed to marry the co-wife of achois zukukasoi. So they're equally prohibited. And again, according to Shmuel, if they are equally prohibited, doing chalitza on one should work for both.
Who says it's equal?
Oh, the Gemara is going to say that at the end. So the Gemara says now, Shmuel nami hischel v'lo hischel ka'amar. Understand, Shmuel was speaking about who you should do chalitza with first and second, and let's see what Shmuel is saying. What Shmuel meant to say is the following: Hischel ba'achayois. If you began doing chalitza with the sister, so the case was he did it first with Leah, then lo yikmar b'tzarois. Then you can't do chalitza only with the co-wife. In other words, if you did it with Leah, then what will you have to do with the other brother, Rachel and the co-wife? You'll have to do chalitza both on Rachel and on the co-wife. And like we learned, because now both of them become asur because of achos chalutzasai or tzaras achos chalutzasai. However, that's what Shmuel was trying to tell you. If the living brother doesn't want to do chalitza with every single one, or with almost every single one, begin with the co-wives. His chil b'tzarais. If he does chalitza with Leah's co-wife, Leah is exempt because you did it with one wife, you're exempt from the other wife. Yeah. But Leah is not the chalutza. Rachel is the only one related to Leah, not the other co-wife. So here there is no achois chalutzasai. You have the Rachel is a sister of the tzara of a chalitza. That's not a problem. The time we learned that mutar adam ekreivas tzaras chalutzasai. Period. So now we have one approach of explaining Shmuel. Recapping, Shmuel holds ein zika. Shmuel does not accept Rav's concept of chalitza psula. Even when one is not allowed to do yibum, sometimes the chalitza done with her will resolve it for her and for the co-wives. You don't have to do chalitza again and again. Shmuel does hold of a concept of a chalitza ma'aliyah, which means a superior and a inferior chalitza. And whenever there is a superior or an inferior, you have to pick the superior. And if you pick the inferior, then you have to do it again with the other one. That's one way of understanding Shmuel. And Ravashi, Omar lo'olam kiddukamart. Let me go back to tell you that Shmuel holds yesh zika. That's going to be a lot better because Shmuel really holds yesh zika. Which is why Shmuel holds that if the Shemeres Yavam dies, the living Yavam is not allowed to marry her mother. Because it's almost like the mother of an erva. Because yesh zika. Now, if yesh zika, what was the original question? The original question was that just like the sister's chalitza is a inferior chalitza, because yibum is aser. Why was yibum aser? Achayz zikukasei. Normally, same thing with the tzara. That was the question. You cannot marry tzaras achayz zikukasei. So the Gemara is going to say that prohibition is a lesser prohibition. Let's read it inside. Umishum deloy alima zika l'shavye l'tzara ke'erva taka yesh zika. When it comes to the sisters, there's an isur called achayz zikukasei. And even though the Chachamim decreed that you're not allowed to marry the tzara of achayz zikukasei, that's not as great of an isur as marrying the sister herself. So, simple. Since marrying a sister is more problematic, yibum is more problematic, marrying yibum with the tzara is less problematic, even though you will not do neither of them, Nevertheless, do chalitza with the one with whom you have a less isur of connection. It's a superior chalitza. And doing it with her will resolve it for both. And the Gemara says, Tayin kavasi de Ravashi, and I'll prove you from a brayse that Ravashi is right. It says in a brayse, cholatz la'achoyos, loi nifteru tzaros. This is din of Shmuel, which implies, cholat tzaros nifteru achoyos. If you do it to the tzaros, right, plural, then the sisters become freed. My tama, it must be because he holds yesh zika. And veloy alima zika l'shavi l'tzarik erva. So that's a raya l'chayra to Ravashi. It's such a good raya that why it's almost like a question on the first answer, explaining Shmuel that Shmuel never meant that you can do it with the sisters. He only meant that if you began with the co-wife of one sister, only then can you do it with the other one. So the Gemara says, Amar of Abba Bar Mamel, maybe this brayse is Beis Shammai. And what does Beis Shammai hold? Beis Shammai B'chlal holds that a tzara of a erva herself is mutar b'yibum. That was the whole machlekes we had in the beginning of the tractate. Maybe this is Beis Shammai that holds that even if one has the Yevamos and erva, which is why it's asur in yibum and exempt from chalitza, it doesn't go to the tzara. Matir matzaras la'achem. In fact, the Gemara, 1 second. If it's Beis Shammai, then you can take and marry the co-wives. Why would you not marry the co-wives? So the Gemara answers, it could be because this brayse goes according to the opinion, like we learned of Rabbi Yochanan the Nuri, that wanted to make a compromise between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. That he said, that they should be only undergo chalitza, not ibum. We learned before that lo hispiku ligman asadavar ache nitrfa hasha, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's takana did not come to its fruition. But the Gemara counters, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak achrav chazru v'tiknu. No, that afterwards actually they enacted Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's takana, and this might be this brayso. So it's not a raya to Ravashi nor a kasha to the first answer. But coming back, we learned 3 dinim of Shmuel. Recap, din number 1 is the din that we just learned about, and we had the 2 other dinim. What were the 2 other dinim? That if a man was married, it was Reuven and Shimon. Reuven was married to 2 wives, and Reuven dies. Comes along Shimon, the genius, and instead of doing yibum or chalitza, he gives a get to one of the co-wives. And midrabanan, now that he gave a get to one of the wives, he cannot do yibum with either of them anymore. But on the other hand, they still need chalitza. So says Shmuel, chalitza with whom? With the one that's not needing the get. Because since the one that needs the get needs a get and chalitza, which means chalitza doesn't resolve it for her. It means chalitza shvach, it's a weak chalitza. The other one can just get away with chalitza, give it to the other one.
So if he gives chalitza to the other one, he only gives a get to the other one.
That's right.
Chalitza to the one that he didn't.
When he gives chalitza to the one that he gave a get, he's going to have to give another chalitza. Very good. And the third din of Shmuel was that if a person did mimer, and then he decides not to marry them, so and then the din will be that he has to give again both a get and chalitza. Again, give chalitza to the one that doesn't need the get. And if because wherever you have a rabbinic marriage, you have to sever that also. The get is not enough. No question, because midaraisa, the mimer meant nothing. If we learn that mimer is only midarabanan, so that's why you need to have chalitza or yibum. Yibum is not allowed and doesn't want to be with her. Okay, let's read inside. So now you buy lahu, turning the page, daf chav zayin amud beis, balas haget u balas mimer. What happened? Now we're putting cases 2 and cases 3 together. All right. Now he gave a get to one, and he gave mimer to the other. And Shmuel is saying whenever there's a superior and an inferior chalitza, you have to give chalitza to the one that we consider that chalitza ma'alya. Now if you have to put together one of them you gave a get to. So we said that chalitza is shvach, because this woman, a get and chalitza. The other one you gave mimer to, she will need a get and chalitza. And now you have to give chalitza. Who should you give it to? Do we say balas aget adifa mishum da aschel ba b'chalitza, or do we say balas maimer adifa because he got closer to her because he already had mimer? All he needs with her, if he would have done yibum, is just to have a relation with her.
Is the question at this point?
According to Shmuel,
to give chalitza to one of them?
The question is if if they're both equally bad, if they're both equal, then of course chalitza to one will be good for both. But do we consider these two, this a scenario where one is considered ma'alya, one is inferior, and one is superior? And in such a case, Shmuel will hold that if you give it to the one who's inferior, you have to give it again to the other one. So Amar Abashi Tashma, what is Rab Shimon ben Gamliel? What are we talking about? So here we're speaking about the following case. That a person had it fell to a person two co-wives to Yibum, and he gave a get to one. And what did we learn? What's the din? Once he gave a get to one, what does he have to do? He has to do, he cannot do Yibum anymore. However, he has to still give Chalitza. Now, the din is like this, that a man is not allowed to marry any other relatives of his wife, even after he divorces her. The fact that the living brother chose to give a get to one of the widows, now that he gave a get, he's going to have to give chalitza. The din is going to be that he's not going to be allowed to marry any of her relatives. He cannot marry now her sister. Midaraisa, you cannot marry your wife's sister. Here, you cannot marry your chalitza's sister. You cannot marry her mother. You cannot marry her daughter. What about the other co-wife? Since with the other co-wife you did nothing, and whenever you do chalitza with one, we explain that retroactively clarifies that you only had zikah to her, which means the other co-wife was just your brother's wife. But you can marry her mother, you can marry her sister. What happens if this genius gives a get to both? The surviving brother gives a get to both. So there's a machlokes if we say yesh get la'achar get or ein get la'achar get. Ein get la'achar get means, since you gave a get to the first, even though that means you can't do yibum with her, you have to do chalitza, but that created the bond with her. Now that you created the bond with her, you will have to sever it. With all of the isurim later, you can't marry her mother, her sister, her daughter, but it doesn't go on the other one. Even though you gave a get to the other, the get that you gave to the other wife meant nothing.
Why does that one mean less than the one that you gave to the first one?
Because the first one was a woman whom you could have done yibum with. And now that you gave a get to her, so even though it's not a direct connection, but now you're dealing with her. And now all her relatives become prohibited on you. The act of her giving a get already was cause enough for the Chachamim to say you can't marry either of the sisters, and you need to have chalitza. But since you gave the get to her, it connected you to her. So the isurim of her relatives is her relatives and not the co-wives. So we learned over there that Rashbag says, ein get la'achar get. And the same thing is with Maimer. What's the case of Maimer? A man dies, he leaves two co-wives. You did Maimer with one of the co-wives. Now you decided you don't want to be with them. So what did we learn? What has to happen here? You have to both give her a get and give her chalitza. Here also, the din will be that you cannot marry after you give her the get and chalitza, you cannot marry her sister. You cannot marry her mother, her daughter, her relatives. What happens if the living Yavam did Maimer to both? So again, the one Tana holds that ein maimer achar maimer. The maimer you did to the second one means nothing. And at the end, after chalitza is done, you could marry the relatives of the other.
Even though you still have to give a get.
Even though you have to give a get, correct. So even though that Rab Gamliel holds that ein get la'achar get and ein maimer la'achar maimer, and therefore you can marry the relatives of the second. However, he holds sheyesh get achar maimer u'maimer achar get. This guy went ahead. His brother died. He left two wives. So the living brother gave a get to one and did maimer to the other. Now don't forget, once he gave a get to one, the maimer he did to the other will not be allowed to come to fruition, because once you give a get to one of the Yevamos, which was something that you were not allowed to do. Either do Yibum or do Chalitza, you don't give a get. So the Chachamim asked you to marry them. So your Maimer to the other, you can argue, meant nothing. Says this Bryce and says no. That Rab Shimon Gamliel holds that your Maimer to the second is something. Yesh Maimer la'achar get v'yesh get la'achar Maimer. And now, even though at the end you're going to give Chalitza to both, means you're going to give Chalitza, you won't marry either of them, but you're not allowed to marry neither of their sisters. Now says the Gemara, why? If when it comes to the question. What was the question on Shmuel? The Balas Haget or the Balas Hamaimer? Which one is Adif? If one is stronger than the other, then you should only be prohibited to marry the sisters from the one with whom you did something that's considered Adif. And by the fact that we are learning that they're both equally prohibited, that Yesh Get La'achar Maimer, Yesh Maimer La'achar Get, it means that they're both equal. And if they're both equal, then what will be the din over here? You can do Chalitza with either one you want. And it's going to work for both. You would not need both. Now, I get adif le'lahani maimer abasrei. Ve'i maimer adif le'lahani get abasrei. Elolav shmamino ki eladini nishmamino. And the end of that. So now we finished the sugya of Rav and Shmuel, and now we're moving on. Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Now comes a new case. Now look at this. It's fantastic. Beis achoyos Yevamos shenaflu lifnei Yavam Echad. Back to a case of three brothers, the simple cases. Two brothers married two sisters, both of them died, and you have one brother who has to do midrabanan, that he can't do yibum. He can't do yibum with either of them. He has to do chalitza with each one. Now you have to remember one thing. This is the first time we're talking it out this way. Let's go to our case. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Leah, and now Levi is living. When the first brother died, when Reuven died, don't forget that. There was only one widow to Levi. Who was the widow? Reuven's wife, Rachel. There wasn't her sister yet in Yibum. Levi then had a mitzvah of either Yibum or Chalitza, and he would be allowed to do Yibum with Rachel. When did Rachel become prohibited on him? Only after Shimon died. Now that Shimon died, so now Rachel has a sister which also fell to Yibum. So two sisters that fall to Yibum, since you can't marry a woman and her sister, so now she became Asur. Remember that idea. No, it's the Isur on the first one is very different than the Isur of the second one. Shimon's widow was Asur from the moment she fell to Yibum. There was never a moment where there was a heter in Yibum to her. The widow of Reuven was mutter until Shimon died, and therefore, so he says, Chalatz l'rishaynam hutra. When Levi does chalitza to Rachel, Rachel is free. Chalatz l'shniya, Levi has to do also chalitza to Leah. They're not co-wives. Each one is coming from a different bias, and then Leah becomes mutter. The question is, what happens if Mesa Rishayna? What happens if before Levi had a chance to do Chalitza with them, Rachel died? How many sisters are left now? Leah. Now, when Leah fell to Yibum, from the beginning, she was never allowed to marry Levi in Yibum. Because when she fell to Yibum, her sister Rachel was also already awaiting Yibum. So one might have thought that even if Rachel dies now there's only one sister, allow Levi, if he wants, to do Yibum with Leah. So this opinion says that he can do Yibum with Leah. What's the Chiddush? Even though originally she began in the Isser. And therefore, therefore there's no need to say in the other case that if Mesa Shniya, this is all Rav, that at first Leah died, and now there's only Rachel living, then for sure, Shemuter b'Rishayna, that now Levi is allowed to marry Rachel. Mishum dahavia Yevamos shuhutra, because Rachel really from the beginning was mutter. It's only that later Venesra, the prohibition came onto her later, and now the chazra v'hutra, and now that the sister died, so she's again not achay zukuka. There's no zukuka living, so therefore, for sure, tachzer lehetera harisha. So according to Rav, no matter which one died first, which sister died first, the remaining brother will be allowed, if he wants, to do yibum with the remaining sister. That is Rav. Says Rabbi Yechanan, and he disagrees with this. And Rabbi Yechanan Amar, if Mesa Shniya, you're right. Again, the case, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven married Rachel. Shimon married Leah. Levi's living. Reuven died first. Rachel fell to Yibum first. And when Rachel fell to Yibum at that moment, Levi could have done Yibum. Then Shimon dies. Now there's an Isser for him to do Yibum with either of them. So if Mesa Shniya, if now Leah dies, here Rabbi Yechanan agrees with Rav. Now Levi can go and marry, if he wants, Yibum with Rachel. Why? Mutter b'Rishayna, because she began Mutter. The Isser only came later. Aval but Rabbi Yechanan says, if Rachel dies, Aval Meser Rishayna, Asu B'Shniyah. Levi will never be allowed to marry Leah, even if Leah doesn't have a living sister, which is falling to Yibum, to the same Levi. Why? My Tama. Because Shekol Yevamos. She'ein ani koiraba b'sha'as nefila. Any Yevama, which we cannot read the verse, when she became up for Yibum. When Yibum came up, Yevama yavoy oleha, that her brother, the brother of the deceased, should have a relation with her. If you never had such a permissibility, so then the original prohibition that a man cannot marry his brother's wife stays in place. She becomes an erva. Just like if Reuven died and he had kids, and his wife is Rachel. Levi is never allowed to marry Rachel, she's an erva. She's your brother's wife. So since over here from the beginning, speaking about Leah was not permitted because she was a choysuku kasai. Even if Rachel dies, she remains asir. Which makes a lot of sense. So the Gemara says, V'rav lei hai svara. How can Rav disagree with that? Rav himself said that Kol Isha she'ein ani koiraba b'shas nefila Yevama yovei aleo. Rav says harehi ke'eshes ach sheyesh libanim va'asura. For example, the best example, a man is not allowed to marry two sisters. This is one of the only erevas that have a heter. So Reuven is married to Rachel. When he's married to Rachel, he cannot marry Leah. Even if he divorces Rachel, he cannot marry Leah. But if Rachel dies, he could marry Leah. So what would happen? Reuven is married to his wife Rachel, and Leah was married to his brother Shimon. In this case, the first Mishnah, and Shimon dies. What's the din? Reuven is not allowed to do Yibum to Shimon's wife. Why not? Because she is his wife's sister. What happens if before he gave her chalitza, I'm sorry, and he doesn't have to give her chalitza, doesn't do nothing. What happens now if Reuven's wives dies? Rav himself said, if Reuven's wives dies, you can't now say, now Reuven has to do Yibum or chalitza with Leah. No. Since when Shimon died, when Levi became a candidate, so to say, for Yibum, she was right away prohibited on her brother because of Eishes Ach. Rav said that. So that prohibition can never be taken away. So why would Rav say different over here? Not true, this is the Raisa, that's the Rabbanan, but why does Rav disagree with Rabbi Yechanan? So the Gemara answers, Hanimili heicha deka ba'apa isur Eishes Achos isur the Raisa. That Rav says, no, that's the whole difference. When Leah is prohibited on Reuven, the case we just gave, because of a Da'iraisa, because Reuven was married to Rachel. So the moment Yibum came up, it was knocked down because of the Isur Da'iraisa. She will never be allowed to go back to Yibum, even if the circumstances changed. Aval Hachi, but in this case, the only reason why in the case of three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Leah, and they both die. Why can Levi not do Yibum with either of them? Because of a rabbinic Isur of Achayzukul Kasai. Zika is only the Rabbanan. Therefore, Rav holds, even if from the beginning she was Asur, the moment one of them died, then the mitzvah goes back. Okay. Eisvei Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina Rabbi Yechanan. Challenge Rabbi Yossi to Rabbi Yechanan. We're going to see later that he's going to quote our Mishnah, four brothers. The same Mishnah can be quoted as a kasha against Rav. Don't forget, Rav was even more chamur than Rabbi Yechanan in this case. So now the Gemara is going to say, now, Akasha and Rabbi Yechanan. We learned in our Mishnah that if you have four brothers, two of them are married to two sisters. Right? That was like, and Umeisa on the swims, and the two who were married to sisters dies. So the Mishnah says, even though you have two brothers, and one could have argued, one brother should do Yibum with one, and the other brother should do Yibum with the other, said the Mishnah, Harei Elu, Cholzos, V'loi Misyabmais. Frag the Gemara, Va'amai. Why? Leiku Chad Minayu. Lachlitz la lishniya. Why, if the first one brother has to do chalitza, so why don't we say that he should do chalitza to whom? Let's halt up according to Rabbi Yechanan. No one died at the same time, right? They died. One died after the other. So Reuven died first. Rachel was at that moment when Reuven died. The two surviving brothers, Levi and Yehuda, could have done Yibum with Rachel. What was the problem? That before they did anything, Shimon died. And therefore the Mishnah says, you got to do chalitza, you can't do Yibum. So let one of the brothers do chalitza with whom? With Leah. It's fantastic. Leah is the second one. The moment you did chalitza with Leah, that retroactively knocked off the zika. And according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, that you agree that if someone was permitted in the beginning, even if later there was a problem that came up, if that problem goes away, the original permission, the original heter goes back to its place. So let you do chalitza with the second one, and v'tehevi rishoyin l'gabe idach ki Yevamos shehutra v'nesra v'chazar v'hutra, and then tachzer lehetera harishoyin. Let the Mishnah allow one brother do yibum with the first Yevama.
But it doesn't allow that.
Huh?
Question does not allow.
So Amalei. So therefore, look at Rabbi Yochanan. This is a very unusual answer. Rabbi Yochanan agrees with this so much that he holds that our Mishnah is not a real Mishnah. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan holds 4 brothers, 2 of them married 2 sisters. They both died. Rabbi Yochanan holds 1 brother should do chalitza with the widow who became widow later. And then the other brother, if he wants, can do yibum with the first. And he said, I don't know who learned this Mishnah. It wasn't Rabbi Yehuda. It wasn't Rabbi. This is something that's hardly ever found in the Shas. That you have an Amoira that's going to, because of his logic, is going to say that the whole Mishnah is not correct. And the Gemara now is going to be so bothered with it, the Gemara is going to ask, why couldn't Rabbi Yochanan answer A or B or C? Even if it's doichik, it's better to answer something that doesn't fit perfectly than to challenge the whole validity of the Mishnah. And let's hop a few minutes of this. So the Gemara says, V'lei malei, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan answers that when the Mishnah says that choltzois, it didn't mean that both of them have to do chalitza. Maybe it only meant that one of them should do chalitza. And Eina Chanami, the other one can do yibum with the first widow. So the Gemara says no, because choylet says with that vowels, taka means lashon yachid. But our Mishnah says chol tzois. Chol tzois means they both have to do chalitza. So the Gemara Vayta asks, why don't we say chol tzois the alma, like we had on Amud Aleph, that in every case one of them has to do chalitza, not the other. But when you speak about a din, you can always use the plural expression by saying whenever there's such a case, you always have to do chalitza to the second widow. So the Gemara says, Harei elu ktani. The Mishnah says that both of them need to do chalitza. I v'leima the chalitz l'rishoyna bereisha choltzois. Why don't you answer that? Why does the Mishnah say you have to do chalitza to both? That's going to be only in the case, according to Rabbi Yochanan, where the one brother did chalitza to the first widow. Now, even though chalitza was done to the first widow, you still have to do chalitza to the second widow, because the second widow was never permitted. Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph. So the Gemara says, no, it's not a good. He couldn't have answered that because lechatchila ktani. The Mishnah did not differentiate. The Mishnah said that both of these women need chalitza. Period. So why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan answer? Really, you should be allowed. If you did chalitza to the second, you should allow to do even the first. But it's a typical rabbinic decree. The rabbis were afraid to permit it in this case because they might confuse it with the other case. So the Gemara says no, because the Mishnah says v'loy misyapmais ktani, which means the lekad din yibum hachi klal. The Mishnah says not just choltzos. The fact that the Mishnah says choltzos v'loy misyapmais, those extra words, it's almost a repetition. Do chalitza, not yibum. Well, obviously, if you say you have to do chalitza, you understand you can't do yibum. The Mishnah means that it's not a rabbinic decree. It means that there is no yibum period here. I have another answer. Yevamos mitzvahs Yevamim. Why don't we say that the reason why Rabbi Yochanan says that you have to do chalitza, you can't do yibum? Because if Rabbi Yochanan would allow for chalitza to happen from one brother to the second one, he did chalitza, and then theoretically, what will be the din that the other brother can do what? Can do what would happen if the other brother would die now? 1 second, then the brother who's still living cannot do yibum with her. Why not? Because she becomes achois chalutzasoy. So therefore nothing will happen with her. So not to be mavatal, they said to do chalitza with both. The Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan l'misaloi chayish. And we'll stop over here. And he had no other option other than saying that our Mishnah is, I don't know who learned this Mishnah. I just want to say the following, that we are in the heart of Yevamos, just some words of chizuk. I heard a very good word, that the word Gemara is an abbreviation for the 4 main malachim. Gabriel, Michael, Rafael and Uriel. That in the schools of learning Pasha, the Gemara and Rashi, the Tanoim and the Amoraim, that this connects us to all of the Malachim and it brings us brachas and yeshuos. And it doesn't get more complicated, but on the other hand, we're up for the challenge. This is fantastic. And ultimately, this is mamash godliness, and this is how we connect to Hashem. And there will be matzliach to go through this b'simcha.